all of us have an image of church. And if I'd give you 5 minutes, a piece of paper and a pen, and just say, fill in this blank, church is, what would you start writing on that blank piece of paper, right? You would fill it up because you have an image of what you think church is. And this isn't a right or wrong thing. It's just reality. We all have that image. And for all of us, what we'd write down would be very unique to our story, to who we are. Now, there might be some common connecting points, but your piece of paper would be just very specific to you. And everything that you would write on this line, church is, what you would fill on, what words you would put on that blank, are largely connected to, well, your childhood. I mean, think about growing up, what church was like for you growing up. I mean, that's part of this image. Maybe you grew up in a family where church was Easter and Christmas. I mean, it was just, you went twice a year, and really what you were excited about going wasn't so much about going to church, but you got a new Easter dress, a new outfit, right? You're like, oh, new clothes, I love this time of year. For some of you, you grew up in a house where you lived at the church. Every time the church doors were open, you were there, like, no more church. Sunday morning church, Sunday evening church, Wednesday church. I mean, church. Your childhood. I mean, what your mom thought about church, what your dad thought about church, develops this image of church for you. What your mom and dad talked about in the car on the way to church, this image. What your mom and dad talked about after church in the car. What your mom and dad said about that pastor, right? All of that comes into the image that you would write down church as. You have an image. And not only your childhood, but what denomination that gets attached to your childhood upbringing. Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Brethren, Church of Christ, Church of God, Lutheran, you name the denomination. Your denomination forms the image of what church is. I grew up in a house, and the church we went to was a non-denominational church. And you might be wondering, well, what's that? And that's my exact point. It's always been confusing because people walk up to me and are like, well, what type of church did you grow up in? And if I grew up Catholic, it'd be simple. I would say Catholic, and everyone knows what Catholic is. Or if I grew up Methodist, I would say Methodist, and everyone knows what Methodist is. But I tell people, well, I grew up in a non-denominational church. And they kind of like tilt their head and stare at me like, what's that? Then I have to explain it. Well, I go, we weren't tethered to a denomination. We're non-denominational, but there's other non-denominational churches that all link together, so we're kind of like the non-denomination denomination. Make more sense. And they would tilt the other way and stare at me like, no. I mean, we weren't a denomination, but we're a non-denomination denomination. So I wish I could just say I was Lutheran, right? Like that would be simple. But I don't have that luxury. But guess what? My childhood and my church upbringing all shapes the image of what church is. But not only does your childhood and denomination, right? Every denomination, even non-denominational denominations, they have rules. Some of those rules are public. Some of those are secret rules. You don't discover them until you break one. Right? Some of you, first time walking into Tri-County Church, right? You smelled coffee, and you're like, oh, that's cool to have coffee. Can you have coffee in church? Then you got your coffee, and you're literally watching people to see where you could carry the coffee, and you weren't sure if you could carry the coffee into the sanctuary. Right? You're like, can I? Right? There's rules. I mean, clothing rules. I can always tell when someone steps in for the very first time to one of our locations because they come in their Sunday best. They have their dress on, they have a suit and tie, and I feel so awkward because they walk into a lobby filled with people, with jeans on or shorts on. They're like, I didn't know about the clothing rule, right? There's all these rules. My first ministry job, I was 22, and I was a junior high pastor. I was over all the junior high kids, and we had church for junior high kids on Sunday morning. It was awesome. We had about 100 junior high kids all packed into this one small room, and there's nothing like the smell of junior high boy. And one Sunday morning, our service was about ready to start, and I realized I forgot something. So I was running back to my office. It was a large building. I was running back to my office to get that thing I forgot. And I was running fast because church was about ready to start. And you don't want to leave 100 junior high kids on their own, right? I had great adult leaders, but still. So I'm running to my office. I grabbed that thing I forgot. And I was sprinting back as fast as I could to get back there on time. And as I was making my way up, and it was kind of this long, wide hallway, and it kind of had a gentle slope up. I'm running up, and all of a sudden I hear this voice scream out to me, "Son, don't run in God's house." Well, it stopped me in my tracks for two reasons. First reason was this. I was on staff. They were paying me, and I realized she thought I was a teenager, right? I look young now, but at 22, I look 12. I embrace all of that, but I realized she doesn't realize that I was on staff. I had only been there a few months, right? And I'm like, I'm not sure how to respond to you. I'm like, I'm in charge of kids, right? But the second thing that slammed into my mind was she grew up in a context where you couldn't run in God's house. But I grew up in a context, right, where the church, they wanted kids running around, not disrespectfully, not out of control. But I grew up in a church where they celebrated that kids wanted to be there. They celebrated the fact that they were creating a church where kids wanted to come to, that the kids were dragging their parents there, where every time the doors were open, I, as a junior high boy, wanted to be at church. I, as a high school guy, wanted to be at church. Why? Because church, growing up, was a place for me to own, to lead, to discover, to create, to be a part. And they were fine with kids running around because they loved the fact that the church was alive. And I had no framework for not being able to run in God's. I didn't understand that. Does that make her right and me wrong, or me right and her wrong? No, it's not a right or wrong thing. It's reality. And all of this leads to what the church experience is like. Some of you really get this because your first time stepping into a Tri-County church location, you experience church completely different than any image you've ever thought of before. I love these stories. I hear these stories almost every weekend. Every weekend. I was talking with someone from one of our locations this last week, and she's been coming around 6 months, and I love to hear people's stories. So I said, tell me about your experience. She goes, well, to be honest with you, the first time I came, I knew what she was going to say. I didn't even know what her childhood denominational rural church image experience looked like, but I could just tell because she wasn't sure if she should say this to me. And she goes, well, the first time I came, I go, you weren't expecting church like this, were you? She goes, no. I'm like, I get it. She goes, but when I left, I said to myself, I got to give it a second chance. And I smiled real big because I always tell people, hey, give us 3 times. 3 times, by the third time it's not for you. I get that, that's fine. Give us 3 times. She goes, so I came back the next week and I said, and? She goes, over the last 6 months, I've only missed 1 time. But you have a framework for what the church experience should look like. And again, it's all tethered back to whatever childhood denomination you were raised in. Good, bad, it's not a good or bad thing. It's real. And so what I try to do with people when they ask me about Tri-County Church, I try to simplify everything. And I say, because they're trying to figure out what we believe and who we are as a church. And they're trying to put us in a box somewhere, right? Because if you can define it by a denominational box, you kind of know what that box is. And I always just push the conversation to this one simple phrase, that we as a church, it's all about Jesus, that Jesus is the subject. Because if I can get us all just to Jesus, now we can actually have a conversation go somewhere. That we as a church, we do everything we can to just keep Jesus the focus, Jesus the subject of everything we do. And that's why we say that we are to love like Jesus loved, live like he lived, lead like he led, and leave behind what he left behind, which is more people to live and lead like Jesus loved, lived, and led. And so it's a great simple phrase. Maybe you've heard of it before. Maybe this is the first time hearing those phrases. But what's amazing is it's really succinct, really catchy, really hope-filled. It's kind of like it's our rallying cry. We just want to keep Jesus the subject, and by doing so, we're going to love like Jesus loved. We're going to live like he lived. We're going to lead like he led, and we're going to leave behind what he left behind. You're like, yeah, it's awesome. But have you ever thought, what does that mean? What does it mean to love like Jesus loved? What does it mean to live like Jesus lived? What does it mean to lead like Jesus led? And what does it mean to leave behind what Jesus left behind? Because if all these are our catchy words, motivating words, memorable words, it means nothing. But if we're to put those into motion, into action in our lives, well, this becomes game changer. Game changer. So over this series, we're going to remove the question marks, and we're going to start with love. What does it mean to love like Jesus loved? When Jesus came on this earth, he was interacting with a group of people with very similar stories as you and me. A group of people that had an image of what church looked like. A group of people that their image was tethered to their childhood. Their image was tethered to their denomination. They were Jews. That was their denomination. They didn't call it a denomination, but that's what it was. Their entire faith belief system was tethered to rules. And their entire faith belief system was tethered to the experience of what church is. They didn't call it church, but that's what it was. And so when Jesus came, he realized that what he had to do was untether this entire belief, spiritual framework to move into a new day. But you see, this belief system, this denomination, the Jewish people, I mean, they had been believing this way. They had been living this way. This is not just generational. I mean, this is 1,500 years in the making. And when Jesus came on this earth, he realized, that there was these 10 commandments. The 10 commandments came from this moment in time where God was nation building. You see, when you read what we call the Old Testament, it's the Jewish ancient text. When you read that, you have to read it through the lenses of God was nation building, right? So many times we miss that point. But God was trying to grab a group of people and structure them differently than every other group of people, every other nation around. So God goes to Abraham and said, one day, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. And Abraham's like, yes, what does that mean? I don't know, but that's exciting, right? And Abraham looks at his wife Sarah and is like, hey, our descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. And Sarah's like, yeah, what does that mean? Abraham's like, I don't know. God just said it, and I'm like going with it. But years and years and years and years and years go by, and they couldn't have one kid. I mean, you can't have descendants as numerous as the stars if you can't have one kid. Finally, they did. And from them came the 12 tribes of Israel. But those 12 tribes weren't a unified nation. And one day, Egypt kind of takes them over, makes them slaves. And over those 400 years, they grew exponentially, but they still weren't a nation. And when God, through Moses, led them out of Egypt, All of a sudden, God's like, now is the time. These 12 tribes are going to become one unified nation, Israel. And God gave them 10 commandments. And those 10 commandments mushroomed into some 613 laws. But remember, all of these laws, if you've read any of the Old Testament, you're like, man, there's rules upon rules upon rules. There's all these thou shalt nots and thou shalts. God was building a nation. And he was building a nation to look different than any other nation around. That's why he said, you don't have any other gods before me. Only worship one God. Every other nation. I mean, they were worshiping many, many, many gods. And God's like, no, no, no. This is going to be different. And Jesus realized he had to untether 1,500 years. 1,500 years. So he could do something new. And when Jesus entered into his public phase of ministry, there was two groups of leaders, influencers, that did not want Jesus to succeed. They were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And both of these groups of people really hated each other, but their hatred for Jesus and their fear surrounding Jesus and what Jesus was doing really brought them together. Because what you have to grasp is the Jewish culture, the Jewish nation Israel, there was no separation of church and state. That their belief system and their political system were all one. There were two different, the church over here and their government over here. It was all one. And the Pharisees leaned more toward their theology, the spiritual side of their faith system. And the Sadducees leaned more on the political side. Now, they both had their beliefs and all of that, but that's just kind of where they lends themselves to. And so when Jesus started gaining more and more people who were listening to Jesus as a rabbi, as a spiritual teacher, the Pharisees got mad. And as Jesus gathered more and more people and they were following him, the Sadducees were really in fear because guess what? They were losing political power. And the Sadducees were all about the political connections, especially to Rome. And so they both weren't sure. But like I mentioned, they both had a belief in God. But there were some stark differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. One of those differences had to do with eternal life. The Pharisees believed that when you died, you went to heaven. When you died, you got to be with God. When you died, there were streets of gold, right? They believed in eternity, heaven. But the Sadducees, they didn't. The Sadducees believed that you had one life here on this earth, and when you died, it was just over. There's no eternity. There's no streets of gold. There's no God, in heaven. That you got to be with. God's in heaven, but your life here on this earth is just over. You just become, dust in the ground. And so the Pharisees were all excited because they're like, hey, you die here on this earth, you get to be with God forever. So they're excited. And the Sadducees were like, when you die, it's just over. And that's why the Sadducees were sad, you see. Thank you. I'll be performing later tonight. My stand-up comedy is coming right along, right? But remember, they didn't like each other, but their hatred for Jesus is what united them. So one day, they came together and they wanted to trick Jesus. They wanted to trap Jesus. So the Pharisees were like, we got this first. So they sent in some experts of the law, and they try to trap Jesus, trick Jesus with a tax question. Because if they could get Jesus to say something wrong, it would get tied to the Roman government. Then Rome would come in and arrest Jesus, and they would be like, problem solved. So they come to Jesus, they set up this whole scenario, and Jesus knew what they're trying to do. Jesus knew their evil intent. Jesus knew that they were going to try to trick him and trap him. And Jesus simply responds, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And the Pharisees walked away, astonished and in awe, and Jesus round one. Well, the Sadducees were like, well, we can do better than the Pharisees. The Sadducees came to Jesus and they set up a law test. You see, they had a Jewish law, one of the 613 laws, and this law is going to feel weird to us some 2,000 years later, but it was actually kind of a good law based on their culture, their context. You see, they had a Jewish law that stated if a woman is married to a man and her husband died and they didn't have kids, that the husband's next brother in line would have to marry her. And that feels weird. And some of you right now are like, I would never marry my husband's brother, right? You're like, that's disgusting. But in that culture, women had no rights. They had no way to provide for themselves. And it was actually a law that would help make sure that this woman was cared for. So the Sadducees come up and they're like, hey, here, Jesus, here's a scenario. Woman married to a man, they don't have kids, he dies, the next brother comes, marries her, he dies, the next brother comes, he dies, the next brother comes, he dies. I mean, 7 brothers, they all die. I'm like, this poor woman. And then she dies. And the Sadducees, who don't believe in an afterlife, say to Jesus, so at the resurrection, when they're in heaven, which one is her husband? What say you, Jesus? And Jesus comes back and goes, don't you even know your own scripture? Don't you read your own Bible? He goes, when you get to heaven, it's not about who you're married to on this earth. You're in the presence of God. And the Sadducees walked away, astonished and awe, and Jesus won round 2. Then the Pharisees were like, okay, we got one more shot. So they sent in their heavy hitter, the best of the best, the most intelligent of all the religious experts that they had, and sent him in, and he asked the law question. He looked at Jesus and he said, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus quickly answered. Jesus knew this. I mean, he grew up, as a child, going to synagogue, being taught by rabbis. Like, he knew the Jewish law. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. I mean, Jesus quoted the great Jewish Shema. To this day, Jewish people quote the Shema every morning and every evening in their daily prayers. This is the greatest of all commandments to Jewish people. And Jesus just nailed it. And this Jewish religious expert, lawyer, was building a scenario, building a case to trap Jesus. But Jesus didn't give him any room, because after he said this, he goes, and the second is like it. Not second in importance, not second in hierarchy. Jesus goes, it's second in sequence, because the second one is just like the first one. And everyone's just silent. And Jesus goes, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Now, you can find this law in the book of Leviticus. It was there. But again, there's some 613 laws. There's a lot of laws there. But all of a sudden, Jesus does something seismic. He says, your entire faith system has been about loving God, vertical. And all of a sudden, Jesus goes, yeah. It's vertical. But then he shifted and said, it's now horizontal. Because as a good God-fearing Jew, you could be okay with God. You could love God. You could pray to God. You could go to synagogue. You could obey all the rules. You could be so good with God and treat each other horribly. And Jesus goes, the second, not in importance, not in hierarchy, but in sequence. Love God. Love each other. And they walked away astonished and awe. And Jesus won round 3. And in that moment, Jesus took those 613 laws and brought it down to 2. But there was an issue that Jesus knew. Because Jesus knows, he knows how we as people think. if we can manipulate a rule, a law, if we could find the escape clause, we do, don't we? In all rules, all laws, we always try to devise a way out. Take the speed limit. If the sign says 65, we know it doesn't mean 65. Have you ever asked a police officer this question? I have. How many miles over the speed limit can I go without you stopping someone? Isn't that a great question? There's a range, isn't there? 65 doesn't mean 65. 55 doesn't mean 55. 25 doesn't mean 25. There's a range. Can I go 68? Can I go 70? Can I go 71? Like, right? We're experts, whatever the rule, whatever the law is, to find the escape clause, to devise a way out. And Jesus knew that there was two issues with this. The first one was that word neighbor. Neighbor. Because Jesus knew that we as human beings are great at developing a category and then developing another category. Jesus knew that people would say, oh, yeah, okay, we're supposed to love our neighbor. And for Jewish people, all that meant was to love other Jewish people, not to love other nations around them. It was just locked into Jewish people. And Jesus was like, my first issue is I got to define neighbor. So one day, another religious expert of the law, comes up to Jesus and asks him a great question. He goes, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus looked back at him and said, what say you? He goes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I think kind of with a smile and a smirk, this religious Jewish expert goes, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, yeah, you've been listening. And Jesus goes, you're correct. Go. You'll get eternal life. But then this religious expert, he asks him the real question. He goes, well, who is my neighbor? Why? Because he wanted to justify himself. He was looking to develop an escape clause, a way out. So Jesus tells probably one of the most famous stories. Maybe you didn't even know this story comes from the Bible, but you're familiar with the term. It's the Good Samaritan. You've driven by hospitals before with those words in the name. We have a law here in the United States called the Good Samaritan law. So Jesus sets up this whole story because one day this Jewish man was walking down the road. This band of robbers came, beat him up, left him on the road to die. He's laying there dying, and all of a sudden a Jewish priest comes walking along the road, sees this guy dying. The priest goes on the other side of the road. Why? Because he had a place to go to. He had people to see, something important to do. Plus, he didn't want to become unclean. The priest walks on the other side of the road, and I think he looked back and said, I'm praying for you. Kept going. And all of a sudden, a Levite, they're one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Levites were the priestly tribe. Levite, same scenario, comes up on this guy dying on the side of the road. He moves to the opposite side of the road. Goes, I got somewhere to go, important people to see, plus I don't want to become unclean. I'll be praying for you. Kept going. And then Jesus said to the Samaritan, Jews hated the Samaritans. Let me say it a different way. The Jews hated the Samaritans. Hated them. They treated dogs better than the Samaritans. They would walk hundreds of miles around Samaria to a different part of the country so they wouldn't have to step foot in Samaritan territory. They hated, they despised, they loathed Samaritans. And Jesus said the Samaritan came, saw the guy died, picks him up, takes him to the next town, goes into the innkeeper and said, hey, I'm going to pay for this man. Make sure he's well fed. Make sure he's cared for. Make sure he has a bed to sleep on. Whatever he needs, make sure he has. And when I come back through, I'll pay whatever bill, no matter what it costs to care for him. And then Jesus looks at this Jewish religious expert and he goes, which one do you think was a neighbor to this man? And the religious expert said, the one who had mercy on him. And what I find so interesting is this religious Jewish expert couldn't even say the word Samaritan. And Jesus defined neighbor as anyone and everyone. Anyone and everyone. But Jesus knew there was an issue with two commands. Because we human beings, if we can, we will take two commands and find the crack and develop our own escape clause. And Jesus knew that he had to take two all the way down to one. It was a night that he was going to walk into the Garden of Gethsemane. It was the night that he was going to be arrested. And he had gathered his 12 closest friends, the leaders, his disciples together. And what's interesting is he's going to make one simple statement that was going to untether the Jewish faith, the Jewish denomination, to set up something new for the entire world, for all of humanity. And this one simple statement had two bookend events on each side. Before he made this statement, he looked at Judas and said, Judas, go do what you've come to do. Hey, Judas, I know you're going to sell me out, so you can leave now. Go sell me out. And then right after this statement, he looks at Peter. He says, hey, Peter, tonight, you're going to betray me not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in between two of his closest friends that were both going to betray him, sell him out. You know what Jesus said? A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. And when he said a new command, for those guys sitting in that house around a meal, what they heard Jesus say wasn't like, this is brand new. Like we use new so many times. Like I didn't have a car and I bought a brand new car. Didn't have this job, but now I have a new job, right? I didn't have it, but now I do. That's not what Jesus was saying. What Jesus used here was this Greek word kainos, which means innovative, fresh, different than you've ever heard it before. This is something I'm shifting your perspective. Because they understood to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. They understood loving your neighbor. But Jesus is like, this is a brand new perspective. You got to look at this through different lenses. That I'm giving you a new command to love one another as I have loved you. And he brought all the laws, all the commands down to one. That we are to love everyone, because everyone matters. And Jesus rapidly decreased the number of commands, but exponentially increased his expectations. And that's why we are to love like Jesus loved, which means we're to love first. Love first. And I know there's something within all of us that we want to create a category. It's like, I'm going to love the people in this box, but I want a secondary box. And these people I don't really have to love. So are you trying to say, Chris, that I'm just going to love the person that believes something different? They have a different political ideology than me. I'm like, yeah, love them. Do you mean that I have to love the person that keeps stabbing me in the back? Yeah, you got to love them first. Do you mean that I got to love the person? I got a friend and she has a spouse and they're going through a nasty divorce and he's just evil. Do I have to love him? Yep, you got to love first. Love anyone. Love everyone. Well, Chris, you know, I know this other family and I know what's happening in their home and how they're treating their kids and it's just despicable. Do I have to love them? Yeah, you got to love them. You got to love everyone and anyone because Jesus defined neighbor as anyone and everyone. And we as human beings want to develop this other category and say, but these people. There's no but. It's everyone and anyone, that we are to love people first. Love them first. Why? Because Jesus loved you first. Loved you first. And out of all of these, live like Jesus, that's important. Lead like Jesus, that's important. Leave behind, that's important. But I'm just telling you, everything rests on this. This governs everything. How we love everyone. If we, as a church, a gathering of people, get this right, it is a game changer. Game changer. And Jesus understood the importance of this. That's why he didn't just stop at saying, love everyone. He didn't stop there. He gave us the why. And the why, again, the why is a game changer. He goes, because everyone will know that you are my disciples. Everyone will know that you are a Christ follower. Everyone will know that you are a Jesus follower. Everyone will know if you love one another. So many churches, gatherings of people, get this wrong. And people will run away from God's love because they don't see God's love in them. That's why Jesus said, new command I give you. Gotta love everyone. Gotta love everyone. And that means anyone. No matter what they believe, how they voted, who they live with, what they do. And you can try to convince yourself that all you need is loving God. All you need is to pray to God. All you need is another Bible study to have more knowledge with God. And Jesus would say to you, how are you loving your neighbor? Because that is what matters. So next week, this is the question that's going to bridge the gap between part 1 and part 2. What does love require of me? This question is going to help remove the next question mark. But that will be for next week.